I just have to say, lawyers like to always talk and get the last word. I cannot tell you how much I respected Mr. Melton, Mr. Bond, Dr. Johnson, but I also can't tell you how the community came together in 85 and 86 and 87. How Wilma organized the ladies, we sent them to the Historical Society. The time and effort, the resistance we found, and people would spit at me as I walked up the street. I lost every white client. That's why my practice is all over the state, not as much in Westchester. But the dedication of Mr. Melton, Mr. Bond, Dr. Johnson is phenomenal. Mr. Melton made the center. Mr. Melton mentored so many young people. I see Alice Thomas over there, who is one of the persons. You had to meet these men and women to appreciate what happened and the change, because we forget sometimes. Back in 85 or 86, no black person was allowed on the fire company, on the boards. They wouldn't pick up their trash. They wouldn't plow the streets. You have to understand what it was like back then. I just have to tell you one final story of Mr. Melton, and then I'll sit down. So I promised Lisa I wouldn't talk too long. About a week before the Ward decision came down, we had litigated extensively, and we weren't sure what was going to happen. We had a wonderful judge, Judge Don Stively, who originally had been against us. He told me several times, Sam, withdraw this, you may get sanctioned. But we persevered with a lot of help from the community. Mr. Melton, who had ran a number of times, but was never able to win, even though he had the strong support of the black community, saw this as something that had to be done to change everything. So we were waiting. Mr. Melton, the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks in August, the decision came down in September of 1987, became very ill. He was at Brandywine Hospital. Dr. Butler, who was then president of the NAACP, and a doctor on staff at Brandywine, one of the few, because remember, most of you probably remember, they wouldn't hire black nurses in Westchester at the hospital or other matters until much later. Dr. Butler said to me, Mr. Melton is dying, and he would like to know the decision before he died. So I did something rather unorthodox. I called President Judge Stively, who was a wonderful man, and I said to him, I don't want to know your decision, but if you made it, would you go to visit Mr. Melton at the hospital in Brandywine? And Judge Stively, I talked to his staff, left immediately, got into his car, drove to Brandywine Hospital. Shows you the different world we lived in then. Later that night, I called Dr. Butler to say, what happened? He said, well, Judge Stively came. We talked to him. I introduced him to Mr. Melton in the room, and then I left Mr. Melton and Judge Stively alone. And they were there about a half hour. And I said, yes, and what happened? He said, Judge Stively left, and I went in the room. And I said, Scats, that was Mr. Melton's nickname, because he was the first black athlete ever allowed to play in Chester County high schools. He was a halfback, Scats Melton. I said, Dr. Butler said, I said, Scats, what did he say? He said, Mr. Melton looked at him, smiled, tears coming down his eyes, and then died. And it was a wonderful story, because Mr. Melton meant so much to everyone. And believe me, this award should go to him and those men, Wilma Ford, obviously, Alice Thomas, who just wrote a book and signed it. Well, thank you very much.